Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are opening up a stack of sources that, quite frankly, forced me to completely rewrite a mental map I've had in my head since, I don't know, high school history class.
Oh, I know that feeling.
We're looking at the Safavid Empire. And, usually when you hear Safavid, you immediately think of this great Persian empire.
Yes.
The rival to the Ottomans, the beautiful mosques in Isfahan, the intricate carpets, the whole golden age aesthetic, right?
That is the standard image, absolutely. It's the textbook definition. It's the narrative that has, really dominated the historiography for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
You picture those refined courts of Isfahan.
Exactly. The Persian poetry, the grand architecture.
Yes.
It's this monolithic block of Persian history. But the sources we have today, and these are academic excerpts, research papers, translated analyses, specifically focusing on the Azerbaijani origins and military rise of the Safavids, they're asking us to zoom in.
Way, way closer.
Yeah, way closer. We're not looking at the end product, we're looking at the engine, we're looking at the roots. And it turns out the roots of this empire aren't just generic Persian history. They are specifically, intensely, and undeniably Azerbaijani Turkic.
It is a fascinating shift in perspective, and frankly, it's a necessary one. If you look at the Safavid Empire as this single monolithic thing, just as a Persian empire, from day one to the end, you miss so much nuance.
You miss the whole story, almost.
You really do. You miss the internal dynamics. But if you look at how it started, specifically under Shah Ismail I, you see something very different. You see a synthesis. It's not just the dynasty. It's this incredibly potent mix of a Sufi spiritual order, raw military might, and this is the real key language.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We want to move beyond that generic history and really explore the specific cultural engine that powered this rise. Because the aha moment for me reading through these notes was the realization that this wasn't a one-note empire. It was a bilingual state. The sword and the crown, they spoke Azerbaijani Turkic, while the pen of the bureaucracy often spoke Persian. And it creates this tension, this duality that I think is totally missing from the popular understanding.
It's a distinction that often gets lost in broad strokes history.
Yeah.
We tend to paint the past in single colors, don't we?
We do. We want it simple.
You want it to be simple. We want it to be the Persian Empire. But here we have a very distinct dual-colored canvas. And to understand it, we have to look at the man who essentially painted it, Shah Ismail I.
The central figure? The man of the hour?
He is the absolute center of gravity for this entire era. Without him, there is no Safavid Empire as we understand it. It just doesn't happen.
So let's introduce him properly. Shah Ismail I, in the history books, he's the founder, he's the king, the Padishah. But what jumped out at me from the source material is that king is almost too small a word for him.
It is.
It feels like calling a hurricane a breeze.
It's totally inadequate because king implies a strictly political role. It implies administration, borders, taxes. Ismail's that, certainly. He's a statesman. But to his followers, and, to himself, he was the Murshid-i Kamil.
Which translates to?
It translates to the perfect spiritual guide.
Perfect spiritual guide. That's a heavy title. That implies a kind of infallibility, doesn't it?
It's an all-encompassing title. It means he wasn't just leading a country, he was leading souls. He was the head of the Safavid order, the Safaviya, which was, at its heart, a Sufi order. So his followers didn't just owe him feudal loyalty.
No.
They owed him spiritual obedience. But then you have to add the third layer, which is the one we're really going to unpack today. He was a poet.
And not just a dabbler?
No, not at all. He didn't just write a few rhymes in his spare time. He was a prolific, skilled poet, writing of the pen name Khatayi.
We're going to get deep into the poetry later because, spoiler alert, it wasn't just art. It was a weapon. It was a tool of statecraft. But before we get there, we need to set the scene. Geographically, where does this story even start? Because if we're rewriting the mental map, we need to know where to drop the pin. And it doesn't start in Isfahan.
No, and that is such a crucial distinction. If you start in Isfahan, you're starting at the end of the story, or at least, well into the middle. The heartbeat of this early movement, the cradle of the Safavids, is in the Azerbaijani region.
Okay.
Specifically, we need to look at the city of Tabriz and the family's ancestral base in Ardabil. This is the stage. This is where the Safavid identity was forged.
Okay, let's unpack that identity, because this is where that whole nature versus nurture debate comes in. When you look at the Safavid family tree, it's complicated. I was trying to trace it back in the notes, and it goes all over the place.
It is complex, and historians love to argue about it. It keeps them employed.
Yeah.
If you go all the way back, way back to the 11th century, there are these academic debates about their distant ancestral roots. You'll see scholars citing potential Kurdish origins for the family line, way back in the mist of time, specifically looking at a figure named Firuz Shah Kula.
I saw that in the notes, the ancestral debate. And usually that's where people get stuck. They say, well, his great-great-great-grandfather was likely Kurdish, so he must be Kurdish. Or they try to pin a modern nationality on a medieval figure.
Exactly. And that is such a trap because, and this is a massive but, what matters in history, specifically in the context of empire building, isn't always who your great-great-great-grandfather was. It's who you are.
Who you are in your time.
In your time. It's who you identify with, who you marry, what songs you sing, and what language you speak to your children. The academic consensus, and the point our sources are really driving home, is that by the time we get to Shah Ismail I in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the reality of the dynasty was thoroughly Turkified.
Turkification. That sounds like a process. It implies a change over time. How did that happen? Was it deliberate, or was it just, something in the water in Ardabil?
It was a process of environment and of alliance. Think about where they were. The family settled in Ardabil, which was a hub of Turkic culture. This was a region just dominated by Turkic speakers.
Okay.
But more importantly, they married into it. They intermarried extensively with Turkic families and local royalty. You can't ignore the mothers and the grandmothers in this story.
And the sources mention the Akwa Yunlu specifically. That name came up a lot.
Yes, the Akwa Yunlu, literally the white sheep Turkomans. These were the Turkic tribal confederations that ruled the region before the Safavids. They were the power players. They were the big dogs.
Right.
And by marrying into these families, Ismail's own mother, Martha, was an Akwa Yunlu princess, the granddaughter of the famous Uzun Hasan. The Safavids didn't just gain allies.
No, they absorbed the culture.
They absorbed the culture, they absorbed the language. It became part of their DNA, culturally speaking.
So Ismail isn't just some guy. He is the grandson of the great Turkic ruler Uzun Hasan.
Precisely. So by the time Ismail rises to power, he isn't looking back to some 11th century ancestor. He is a product of his immediate environment, culturally and linguistically. He is Azerbaijani Turkic. That is his world. That is his identity.
So if you were to walk up to Ismail and have a conversation, let's say you meet him in his tent before battle, you're not speaking Persian to him.
No.
You're speaking Azerbaijani Turkish.
Without a doubt. That was his mother tongue. That was the language of his household. It was the language he used to command his troops. And that leads us to this unique synthesis that defined his empire. It wasn't just a kingdom. It was a socio-religious movement.
The notes describe this as a combination of a Sufi spiritual order and a military state. And I want to pause on that because it's hard for us in the modern world to really wrap our heads around. We're so used to separation of church and state, or at least separate institutions.
Think about how powerful that combination is, though. Usually you have a church or you have an army. Sometimes they work together. Kings hire armies and they get blessed by priests. But in the early Safavid state, under Ismail, they were the same thing.
The very same thing.
The structure that provided spiritual guidance was the exact same structure that organized the cavalry charges.
So it's like if a church choir was also a special forces unit?
That is actually not a terrible analogy. A very, very lethal choir. Imagine a group where the person leading the hymns is also the person telling you where to flank the enemy.
Wow.
This synthesis allowed for the establishment of a centralized state because there was no friction between the religious leadership and the military leadership. They were embodied in the same person, Ismail, and the same organization.
And the muscle behind this organization had a very specific name, the Qizilbash.
The Qizilbash.
Now, I've heard this term before, usually in footnotes or passing references, but I always just assumed it meant, soldiers or followers. But the deep dive here suggests it's way more specific than that. What does Qizilbash actually mean?
Literally, it translates to redheads.
Redheads? Like, because of hair color. Were they dyeing their hair or something?
No, not hair color. It refers to their headgear. They wore a distinctive red cap called the Taj. It had 12 gores, or folds, and each fold symbolized one of the 12 imams of Shia Islam.
So it's a uniform.
It was a uniform, yes. But it was also a badge of honor. It was a statement. It marked you as a member of this specific movement. If you saw that red cap on the horizon, You knew exactly who was coming for you.
And who were these people under the red caps? Were they just random conscripts picked up from villages? Because usually big empires just grab whoever is around to hold a spear.
Absolutely not. They weren't a standing army in the modern sense where
Yeah.
you draft people from the general population. The sources are very, very clear on this. The Qizilbash were composed of specific Turkic tribes. This was a tribal confederation at its core.
And we have some names here in the notes. The Ustajlu, the Shamlu, the Afshar.
Correct. Those are the big names. The Ustajlu, the Shamlu, the Afshar, the Qajar, the Tikelu. And you have to look at where they came from, primarily from Azerbaijan, eastern Anatolia, and parts of Syria.
So Turkic tribes.
These were Turkic nomadic or semi-nomadic tribes. They were warriors with a long, long tradition of horsemanship and warfare. And they weren't fighting for a paycheck in the way a mercenary would.
No, they were fighting for something else.
They were fighting for their tribal identity and, crucially, for their spiritual leader.
So the muscle of the empire, the thing that actually allowed Ismail to conquer territory, is these Azerbaijani Turkic tribes.
Precisely. They are the backbone. You cannot have the Safavid Empire without the Qizilbash. They provided the manpower, the cavalry, the generals. The early Safavid state is essentially a confederation of these Turkic tribes, united by their devotion to the Safavid master.
And this brings us back to that spiritual bond. You mentioned earlier that they saw Ismail as the Murshid-i Kamil.
Yeah.
How did that actually play out on the battlefield? Because I imagine believing your commander is a perfect spiritual guide changes the vibe in the trenches.
Oh, it changes everything.
It's not just the general says, take that hill.
No. It impacts morale and cohesion in a way that mere discipline cannot. If you believe your leader is divinely guided, if you believe he is the perfect guide, the shadow of God on earth, you don't just follow orders, you follow destiny.
Wow.
You are willing to take risks that a normal soldier just wouldn't take. There is a fervor there, a religious zeal that is incredibly powerful.
It's devotion versus duty.
Exactly. Duty can falter when you're tired or hungry or outnumbered. Devotion keeps you moving forward. And we see the result of this devotion in 1501, the Battle of Shirur.
This is the pivotal moment, right? The big showdown.
This is the moment where potential becomes reality. Up until this point, Ismail is a young leader of a movement. He's charismatic, he's gathering forces, but he hasn't toppled the big dogs yet.
Not yet.
Shirur is where that happens. It's the Qizilbash versus the Akoyunlu.
And the Akoyunlu were the heavyweights at the time. They were the ones running the show. And ironically, as we said, they were his relatives.
They were the established power. They had the numbers. They had the administration. But at Shirur, the Qizilbash, driven by that insane mix of tribal ferocity and spiritual zeal, just defeated them.
And that victory did what exactly?
It blew the doors wide open. It completely destroyed the Akoyunlu's grip on the region and cleared the path for the Safavids to take power.
So 1501 is the turning point. The sword has done its work. The Qizilbash have proven they can win. But this is where the story gets really interesting to me. We've talked about the sword. Now I want to talk about the pen.
I guess?
Because Ismail wasn't just a warlord.
A Khatayi persona. This is, in my opinion, the most fascinating aspect of his entire character.
This is the part that I think surprises people the most. You have this conquering warlord, Ismail, fresh off the battlefield at Shirur, covered in dust and glory. And yet, the sources say he was a sensitive and prolific poet. And he didn't just write for fun. He wrote an entire divan, a full collection of poems.
It is a remarkable duality. And again, we have to look at the language. This is the crucial detail. He authored this divan almost entirely in Azerbaijani Turkic.
So why is that so significant? Because, I mean, people write poetry in their native languages all the time.
It's significant because of the context of the time. In the broader Islamic world, and certainly in the Persianate world, Persian is the language of high culture. It is the lingua franca of literature. If you want to impress the intellectuals in the cities, if you want to be seen as a cultured king, you write in Persian. You emulate the great masters like Hafez or Rumi. That's the playbook.
But Ismail just throws the playbook out.
He does. He writes in the vernacular of his people. He writes in the language of the Qizilbash. He writes in Azerbaijani Turkic.
And the sources also mention a specific work called the Dahnama.
Yes, the Danon, or 10 letters. This was written in 1506. It is considered one of the most important monuments of early Azerbaijani literature.
Monument is a strong word.
And it is appropriate, because the existence of the Dahnama and the Divan proves something very important about the language itself. It tells us that Azerbaijani Turkic wasn't just a spoken dialect for soldiers or farmers.
It wasn't just kitchen Turkish.
Exactly. It was a language capable of high literary expression. It had nuance, it had rhythm, It had the capacity for complex metaphor. Ismail wasn't dumbing it down by writing in Turkish. He was elevating the language to a royal standard. He was validating it.
That's a key point. He's validating the language of his followers. But there's a cynical side to this too, right? Or at least a pragmatic one. The notes mention political technology. I love that phrase.
Yes, historians are nothing if not cynical, but they're right to use that term. You have to ask why he wrote all this poetry. Was it just because he had a lot of feelings? Maybe. He was a human being.
But probably not just that.
Probably not. The scholar Turkan Gance provides a very compelling analysis. He argues that this poetry served as a vital tool for propaganda.
Propaganda? That feels so modern. We think of posters and radio broadcasts.
It is timeless. Propaganda is just communication with a goal. Think about his audience. Who does he need to keep loyal? Who holds the swords that keep him in power?
The Qizilbash, the tribes.
Exactly. And what language do the Ustajlu and Shanlu tribes speak? They speak Azerbaijani Turkic. They don't speak the high court Persian of the bureaucrats. So by writing poetry in their language, poetry that is infused with religious imagery, with heroism, with the specific ideology of the Safavid order, he is bypassing the Persian-speaking bureaucracy entirely.
He's speaking directly to his base.
He has a direct line to the military. It cements that spiritual bond we talked about. You have to imagine how this poetry was consumed. It wasn't just read silently in a library by some scholar.
No.
It was recited. Minstrels, or ashiks, would travel from camp to camp, singing these poems.
So the soldiers are literally sitting around the campfire, sharpening their swords, and they're singing songs written by their king.
Songs that tell them they are on the righteous path. Songs that remind them of their sacred duty to the Murshid-i Kamil. When the soldiers recite these poems, they aren't just reciting art, they are reciting their loyalty pledge. They're reinforcing the ideology of the state over and over again.
That's brilliant.
It is brilliant political strategy. It mobilizes the masses in a way a formal Persian decree never ever could.
So the poetry is the software that runs on the hardware of the Qizilbash army.
That is a fantastic way to put it. Yes, it programs the loyalty. It's the operating system for the entire movement.
But this creates a weird situation, doesn't it? We've got a king writing in Turkish, an army speaking Turkish, but we all know the Safavid Empire is famous for its Persian administration. We know Persian culture was huge there. How did that actually work on a day-to-day basis? How do you run a country with two languages at the top?
This brings us to the concept of the bilingual state. And this is where the academic research from places like Cambridge Core and Iranian studies really helps us clarify the picture. Because it wasn't a mess, it wasn't a chaotic mix, it was a functional, very deliberate division of labor.
If he wrote in Turkish, what were they speaking in the palace? That's the question I literally wrote down in my notes.
And the answer is, in the palace, in the inner circle, they were speaking Azerbaijani Turkic.
Really? So the corridors of power echoed with Turkish?
Yes. The research highlights that Azerbaijani Turkic was the primary language of the royal court. It was the language of the military elite. It was the language of power and command.
So if you wanted to talk to the Shah,
or the generals, or the inner family, you needed Turkish. We have accounts from European travelers later on in the dynasty who note that the Shah spoke Turkish. It was the language of the ruling class.
Okay, so where does Persian fit in? Because we can't ignore the massive Persian element.
You can't. And Persian remained the language of the bureaucracy, the administration, the tax collectors, the scribes, the diplomats writing formal treaties. They used Persian. It was also the language of high literature and theology in the broader Islamic world. So the state operated on these two tracks.
That just completely challenges the monolithic view, doesn't it? It's not just a Persian empire, it's a functional hybrid.
It is a hybrid where the ruling class retained their specific linguistic identity. They didn't just assimilate immediately into the Persianate world. They held on to Azerbaijani Turkic as a marker of who they were. It was the language of the conquerors, while Persian was the language of the administrators.
The sword spoke Turkish.
And the pen of the accountant at least spoke Persian.
And where was the center of all this? We mentioned it briefly before, but we need to talk about Tabriz. Because in my head, before reading this stuff, I always associated the Safavids with Isfahan.
And Isfahan comes later. Much, much later. Tabriz is the heart. You cannot tell this early story without Tabriz.
In 1501, right after that victory at Sharur, Ismail goes to Tabriz.
He captures it, and that is the moment of coronation. That is where the empire is officially born. Tabriz becomes the first capital.
So the capital of this new empire is deep in the Azerbaijani region.
Correct. For the entire early Safavid period, the center of gravity is Tabriz. It's the cultural and political hub. And this connects back to the continuity you mentioned earlier. Tabriz had been the capital for the Aku Koyunlu as well.
Ah, okay.
So by taking Tabriz, Ismail isn't just finding a nice place to set up a throne. He is stepping directly into the shoes of the previous Azerbaijani Turkic rulers. He's saying, I am the successor. This is our land.
That makes perfect sense. It's all about legitimacy.
Exactly. Later, the capital moves first to Qazvin, then to Isfahan. But that happens for geopolitical reasons, primarily to move the capital further away from the Ottoman threat in the west. But in this foundational era, the heart is Azerbaijani. The court life, the military parades, the coronation, it all happens in Tabriz.
Speaking of geopolitical reasons, let's look at the map. From 1501 to 1514, things move incredibly fast. It feels like an explosion of red caps across the map.
Lightning fast. It was an era of rapid, almost dizzying conquest.
And one of the very first things Ismail does when he gets to Tabriz is declare a state religion, Twelver Shi'ism.
All massive decision. I mean, you could argue it's the most consequential decision in the modern history of the region.
So why do it? I mean, obviously there's faith involved. Ismail was a devout believer. But was there a political angle? There had to be, right?
There is always a political angle. You have to look at who is next door. To the west, you have the Ottoman Empire. Massive, powerful, and staunchly Sunni. The Ottomans claimed the caliphate. They claimed to be the leaders of the entire Muslim world.
So if Ismail is just another Sunni ruler, he's technically, what, subordinate to the Ottomans?
Or at the very least, he has a much harder time distinguishing himself. He's just another regional potentate. But by declaring Twelver Shi'ism as the state religion, Ismail is drawing a hard, bright line in the sand. He's creating a distinct identity. He is saying, we are not them.
We are distinct.
Exactly. It unifies his own diverse followers under one banner, because remember, the Qizilbash were fanatics for the Safavid order, and it's he-inflicted beliefs, and it distinguishes his state from his biggest rival. It was a move to unify the state internally and define it externally. It gave the empire an ideological border as well as a physical one.
And it worked in terms of expansion.
It worked incredibly well. For about a decade, the Safavids were unstoppable. They unified a vast territory. They swept through modern-day Azerbaijan, Iran, Iraq, parts of the Caucasus. They felt invincible.
Until they weren't.
Until 1514.
The Battle of Tal'Darim.
The check on power. The great reality check.
This is often painted as a tragedy in the history books, right? The Safavid cavalry, brave and reckless, just charging headfirst against Ottoman cannons and muskets.
It was a military defeat, certainly, and a brutal one. The Ottoman artillery was decisive. The Qizilbash, with all their bravery and spiritual fervor, just could not overcome the technological gap of massed gunpowder.
They didn't use guns.
They refused to use firearms initially. They viewed them as unmanly or cowardly. They wanted to fight with the sword and the lance, the weapons of true warriors. It was a fatal miscalculation.
But the source material suggests we shouldn't just look at it as a loss. It says it solidified the borders. That sounds like a bit of a glass-half-full interpretation.
It's the nuanced take. Yes, they lost territory in eastern Anatolia. They lost the ability to expand endlessly to the west. But the defeat at Chaldiran forced the Safavids to consolidate. It stopped the rapid, almost reckless expansion and forced them to focus on governing the core they had.
So it forced them to become a state rather than just a conquering movement.
Exactly. It defined the western border of the empire. A border, by the way, that looks remarkably similar to the border between modern Iran and Turkey today.
Yeah.
That line was drawn in blood at Chaldiran.
That's fascinating. So the defeat actually helped define the shape of the nation. It created the container for the empire to mature in.
It absolutely shifted the focus. Post-Chaldiran, the empire concentrated on its Azerbaijani and Iranian core. It became a more settled state. Ismail himself actually went into a deep mourning after this defeat. He stopped leading armies personally. But the structure he built, that bilingual state, the Qizilbash backbone, it survived.
So we've covered the man, the army, the language, and the map. I want to bring this all back to the summary table provided in our source. They call it Safavid Azerbaijani indicators. Let's just do a rapid-fire recap of the evidence just to lock it in for everyone listening.
Let's do it.
Okay, first, capital.
Initially, Tabriz, the heart of the Azerbaijani region. Unmistakable.
Language of power.
Azerbaijani Turkic. The official language of the court, the royal family, and the military command structure.
The military itself?
Is Qizilbash, a confederation of distinctly Turkic tribes from Azerbaijan and Anatolia.
And the literature. The king's own words.
Khatayi's Divan and the Dahnama. These are fundamental works of Azerbaijani Turkic poetry. used as tools of the state.
When you stack it up like that, the roots become just. They're undeniable. You can't brush them aside as a minor detail.
The evidence is overwhelming. The engine of this empire, the spark that started the whole thing, was Azerbaijani Turkic. The Persian administrative layer came later, but the foundation is this.
So what does this all mean for us? For the listener driving to work or washing the dishes right now, why should they care about a dynasty from 500 years ago?
I think it matters because it reframes how we understand the region today. We often look at the Middle East and Central Asia through these very rigid national borders that exist now. We think Iran is Persian, Turkey is Turkish, Azerbaijan is Azerbaijani.
Right, we put things in neat boxes.
But history is never neat. This story shows us that identity is fluid, it's complex, it highlights the profound role of language in state building.
It's not just lines on a map. It's about whose words are being spoken in the halls of power.
Exactly. And it shows us the power of culture. The Safavids didn't just conquer with swords. They conquered with an idea, a spiritual movement. And that idea was communicated in a specific language to a specific group of people. It reminds us that you cannot understand political history without understanding cultural history. You simply can't separate the poet from the king in this story.
And that brings me to my final thought for this deep dive. I've been thinking about Ismail's poetry this whole time. We called it political technology.
We did.
He used it to bypass the elites, the Persian-speaking bureaucrats, and speak directly to his base, the Qizilbash tribes. He used the vernacular, their language, to build a movement from the ground up.
A direct line of communication, bypassing all the gatekeepers.
It makes me wonder if poetry was the social media of the 16th century, a way for a leader to shape the narrative and energize their followers directly, viral content spreading from campfire to campfire. How different is the modern world of political communication, really? We traded couplets for tweets, but the strategy, the fundamental strategy of speaking directly to your base in their own language, it feels exactly the same.
The tools change, but the human need for connection and the political use of that connection remains constant. That is a very provocative thought to end on.
Something to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Azerbaijani roots of the Safavids. It's been a fascinating ride.
A real pleasure to explore it.
We'll see you on the next one. Keep diving.